Welcome to Tales of Warriors channel. Today, we will dive into the riveting world of covert operations of the Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad. This is a compelling stories collection, unveils the clandestine endeavors of Israel's renowned intelligence agency, delving into thrilling accounts of daring missions, strategic triumphs, and the remarkable individuals behind them. Join us on a journey through Mossad's daring covert operations. In this video, we will discover the next 3 operations of Israel's Secret Service legacy. This video is suitable for those who have free time, are ready for bed, driving, or need something as background while studying, cleaning, or relaxing. Episode 10. I Want a MiG-21. Meir Amit, Isser Harel's successor, was a special kind of man. He was firm, decisive, sometimes blunt and querulous, but he was also warm, charming, a soldier and a man of many friends. Moshe Dayan told us once, "He was the only friend I ever had." Meir Amit's life story symbolized the change in the Mossad's leadership. Isser Harel was born in Russia, and belonged to the pioneering generation, while Meir Amit, a Sabra, born in Israel, was the first of a long line of Israeli generals. He had fought in Israel's wars and joined the Mossad after many years in uniform. Isser's generation was unobtrusive, close-mouthed, shrouded in a shadow of anonymity, conspiracy, and concealment. Meir Amit was an army man, with lots of friends and colleagues who knew what he was doing. Life in the shadows was not for him. And while little Isser had charisma and mysteriousness on his side, Amit and his successors had the brutal directness and authority that rank and uniform gave them. Born in Tiberias, raised in Jerusalem, and, finally, a member of Kibbutz Alanim, Meir had spent most of his life in uniform. A member of the Haganah since the age of 16, a battalion commander when the IDF was created, he had been wounded in Israel's independence war, and had later made a brilliant army career. Commander of the elite Golani Brigade, Chief of Operations during the Sinai Campaign, Chief of the Southern, then the Central Command, he was certainly on his way to becoming Chief of Staff, but an ill-fated parachute jump immobilized him for a year in a hospital bed. Partly recovered, after a long convalescence and studies at Columbia University, he was appointed Chief of Amman. And there Ben-Gurion found him that dramatic afternoon in April 1963, when he needed a replacement for little Isser. Meir's first steps in the Mossad were not easy. Many of Isser Harel's colleagues, like Yaakov Karas, couldn't stand his abrupt manners and his self-confidence. Some resigned right away, others took their time. Under Amit's leadership, a change of the guard began. But the internal turmoil against the new Ramsad was nothing compared to what little Isser did to him. In the late spring of 1963, Ben-Gurion resigned from office and was replaced as Prime Minister and Minister of Defense by his close aide, Levi Eshkol. Eshkol launched several initiatives that infuriated his predecessor. One of them was appointing little Isser as his advisor on matters of intelligence. Little Isser was bitter and disappointed after his departure from the Mossad. And when he heard that Meir Amit had done the Moroccans an unusual favor, he went straight for the jugular. Meir Amit's Mossad had established very close relations with the Moroccan kingdom. The Moroccan rapprochement had started during Isser's tenure. The first connections with the Moroccans had been made by Yaakov Karas and Rafi Eitan. In the winter of 1963, Isser told Eitan, in the strictest confidence, Hassan II, the king of Morocco, fears that Egypt's President Nasser plots to assassinate him because of his pro-Western policy. Hassan wants the Mossad to take care of his personal security. The story seemed improbable. An Arab king turns to the Israeli Secret Service for help? The always practical Rafi Eitan and another agent, David Shamran, flew right away to Rabat, the Moroccan capital, with false passports. They were whisked through a secret entrance into the king's palace. There they met the formidable General Aufker, the king's Minister of Interior, whose name alone made people tremble. He was known for his cruelty, used torture against the king's enemies, and was responsible for the unexplained disappearances of many opponents of the regime. Nevertheless, he was the king's most valued advisor on intelligence matters, and any agreement between Israel and Morocco needed his approval. He came to Eitan with his deputy, Colonel Dlimi. Right there, Eitan and Aufker reached an agreement. The Mossad and the Moroccan Secret Service would establish close ties and permanent offices in both countries. The Mossad would train the Moroccan Secret Services and Morocco would give the Mossad agents a foolproof cover throughout the world. A special body would be created for the shared gathering of intelligence. The Mossad would also train the special unit in charge of the king's security. The agreement was sealed by a visit to the king. Eitan Goshli bowed and kissed his hand, and the Mossad got its first ally in the Arab world. 2 weeks later, Aufker was in Israel. The general, used to sumptuous palaces and posh hotels, spent his long visit in Eitan's tiny 3-room apartment in a modest Tel Aviv neighborhood. Eitan did manage to get Philip, the legendary Mossad chef, to cook for his Moroccan guest. Aufker left and came again. The relations of the two services kept improving. In 1965, Aufker asked Mayor Amit for a special favor. The major opposition leader and the king's most dangerous enemy was a Moroccan called Mehdi Ben Barka. After being accused of plotting against the king, he had been exiled, but kept directing subversive activities from his hideouts. Sentenced to death in absentia, he knew that his life was in danger. He operated with extreme caution and Aufker's men had failed to find him. Could the Mossad help? Amit's men helped indeed. Under a clever pretext, they established contact with Ben Barka in Switzerland and convinced him to come to Paris for an important meeting. At the door of the famous Left Bank restaurant Brasserie Lip, he was arrested by 2 French police officers, who, it turned out later, were on Aufker's payroll. Ben Barka was delivered to Aufker and vanished, but a witness testified that he had seen Aufker stab him to death. Mayor Amit himself informed Prime Minister Eshkol, "The man is dead." In France, Ben Barka's disappearance caused an unprecedented political scandal. President de Gaulle was beside himself with rage, and when he heard of Israel's role in the abduction, he didn't spare it in his fury. Isser Harel was stunned. How could the Mossad participate in such an affair? How could Amit play a role in such a criminal, immoral operation, and jeopardize Israel's close alliance with France? He asked Eshkol to fire Amit immediately. Eshkol hesitated, but then appointed 2 boards of inquiry, which found no grounds for any measure against Amit. After all, Amit had lured Ben Barka to Paris, but had not taken part in his abduction and assassination. Little Isser then resigned and demanded the immediate resignation of both Eshkol and Amit. He tried to launch a campaign in the press, but the military censorship strictly forbade any mention of the affair. Isser kept doggedly fighting Amit, but the Ramsad was already engaged in another operation that was utterly crucial to Israel's defense, a secret alliance with the Kurds in Iraq. At the end of 1965, Amit wrote in his memoirs, "Our dream started to become a reality. The unbelievable happened." An official Israeli delegation settled in the camp of the Mullah Mustafa Barzani, the leader of the Kurdish rebels in northern Iraq. The arrival of Mossad officers in Kurdistan was considered a tremendous victory for Israeli intelligence. For the first time, a contact was established with one of the 3 components of the Iraqi nation, the Kurds, who were waging a stubborn, endless war against the Baghdad government. The other 2 components were the Shiite and Sunni Muslims. The rebels, led by Barzani, controlled a large area inside Iraq. If the Mossad succeeded in turning the Kurdish rebels into a strong military force, the Iraqi leaders would be compelled to focus their efforts on their internal problems and their capacity for fighting Israel would be diminished. The alliance with the Kurds could become a real boon for Israel. The first 2 Mossad agents spent 3 months in Kurdistan. Barzani welcomed them in his inner circle, took them with him wherever he went, and revealed to them all his secrets. That first encounter laid the foundation for a close cooperation that was to last for many years. Barzani and the Kurdish military chiefs visited Israel. Mayor Amit and his aides came to Kurdistan. Israel supplied the Kurds with weapons and defended their interests in international forums. Beni Zayevi, the senior Israeli agent who first visited Kurdistan, had left his wife, Galila, in London. She was expecting a child. Beni's son, Nadav, was born while his father followed Barzani in the jagged mountains of Kurdistan. A coded telegram reached Zayevi. It was signed by Ryman, Mayor Amit's codename, and read, "The mother and child are in excellent health. Mazel Tov." When Barzani heard of the baby's birth, he took 4 stones and marked a lot with them. "This is my gift to your son," he said to Zayevi. "When he grows up, he can come to our country and claim his piece of land." And while his relations with the Kurds were developing, Mayor Amit started planning another great Mossad operation, codenamed Yahalom, Diamond, the operation he was perhaps most proud of. During the year preceding Amit's death, we met him several times in his Ramat Gan home. The story started in one of my meetings with General Ezer Weizmann, who was then Chief of the Air Force, he began. "We used to have breakfast together every 2 or 3 weeks. In one of these meetings, I asked Ezer what I could do for him as Ramsad. He said right away, 'Mayor, I want a MiG-21. I told him, "Have you gone mad? There is not even one such plane in the Western world." The MiG-21 was the most sophisticated Soviet fighter plane at that time. The Russians supplied many of those aircraft to the Arab states. But Ezer stood his ground. "We need a MiG-21, and you should not spare any effort in getting us one." Amit decided to entrust the operation to Rehavi Vardi, a veteran operations officer who had already tried in the past to get a MiG-21 in Egypt or Syria. "We spent many months working on this operation," Vardi said years later. "Our main problem was how to transform the idea into an operation." Vardi sent out the feelers throughout the Arab world. After long weeks, he got a report from Yaakov Nimrodi, Israel's military attaché in Iran. Nimrodi wrote about an Iraqi Jew, Yosef Shemesh, who claimed he knew a pilot that could bring a MiG-21 to Israel. Shemesh, single, smart, a womanizer and a bon vivant, had an uncanny ability to befriend people and make them trust him. He was a smooth operator and could be very persuasive, Nimrodi said. He recruited the pilot in the most professional fashion. He worked on him for a year. Only he could do that, nobody else. Nimrodi decided to test Shemesh. He sent him to perform a few secondary espionage operations. Shemesh passed the test with flying colors, obtaining excellent intelligence. Then Nimrodi gave him the green light to launch his operation. In Baghdad, Shemesh had a Christian mistress. Her sister, Camille, was married to the Iraqi Air Force pilot Munir Redfa, also a Christian. Shemesh knew that Redfa was frustrated and bitter. Even though he was an excellent MiG-21 pilot, he was not promoted in rank. Moreover, he was ordered to fly an antiquated MiG-17 to fulfill a disgusting mission, to bomb the Kurd villages. He regarded this as a humiliation and a demotion. He complained to his superiors and was made to understand that as a Christian, he would never be promoted and never become a squadron leader. Redfa, a very ambitious man, concluded that there was no sense in living in Iraq anymore. For almost a year, Shemesh held long conversations with the young pilot, and finally succeeded in convincing him to make a short trip to Athens. Using all his eloquence and powers of persuasion, Shemesh explained to the Iraqi authorities that Redfa's wife suffered from a serious illness, and the only way to save her was to have her examined by Western doctors. She must fly to Greece right away, he said, and asked on her behalf that her husband be allowed to join her, as he was the only one in the family who spoke English. The authorities capitulated, and Munir Redfa was allowed to travel with his wife to Athens. There they met another pilot, Colonel Ze'ev Liran Landner, an Israeli Air Force officer. Liran, born in Poland and a Holocaust survivor, was the chief of Air Force intelligence. He had been asked by the Mossad to help in the Redfa case. Liran and Redfa had several tête-à-tête discussions. Liran pretended to be a Polish pilot working for an anti-communist organization. Munir told him about his family, his life in Iraq, and his deep disappointment with his superiors who sent him to bomb Kurd villages. All the able Kurdish men had gone to fight, he said, and those who had stayed in the villages were women, children, and old people. These were the people he had to kill? For him it was the last straw that made his decision final. He would leave Iraq for good. Following the Mossad's orders, Liran invited Munir to join him on a small Greek island. The Mossad gave Redfa a code name, Yahalom, Diamond. In the serene, tranquil atmosphere of the island, the two men continued their conversations and became good friends. Late one evening, Liran asked Redfa what would happen if he left Iraq with his plane. "They would kill me," Redfa said. "Besides, there is no country that would agree to give me asylum." "There is one country that will welcome you with open arms," Liran said, and revealed the truth to his astounded friend. "I am an Israeli pilot, not a Pole." There was a long silence. "Let's talk about this tomorrow," Liran said, and they parted for the night. The following morning, Redfa told Liran he had decided to accept his offer. The two of them started discussing the conditions for Redfa's defection and the sum of money he would get. Redfa was very modest. "Mayor Amit told me to offer Redfa a certain amount of money," Liran said later, "and to double it if needed. But Redfa immediately accepted my initial offer. We agreed that his family would join him in Israel." From the Greek island they flew to Rome. Shemesh and his mistress arrived from Baghdad. A few days later, they were joined by Yehuda Porat, a research officer at Air Force Intelligence, who started debriefing Redfa. He was polite, very considerate, a man of honor, Porat recalled. He was brave, not talkative, he had none of the inhibitions that you would expect of a man in his situation. In Rome, Liran and Redfa discussed communication methods. It was agreed that when Redfa heard at Radio Kol Israel in Arabic the popular Arab song, Marhabtian Marhabtian, that would be the signal for him to be on his way. But he did not know that while he was meeting his handlers in various cafes in Rome, he was being watched by the heads of the Mossad. "I decided," Mayor Amit told us, "to have a personal look at the pilot before the operation got into its final stage. I flew to Rome and went to the cafe where the Iraqi pilot and my men were supposed to go. I sat at a neighboring table and waited. Then quite a few people walked into the cafe. The guy made a good impression. I signaled to our officer who was sitting with him that everything was all right, and I left. During our meeting with Amit, he insisted on reading to us a passage from his book Head On, which described the group that had walked into the Rome cafe, the Jewish lover, Shemesh, wearing slippers because of a wound in his foot, his mistress, a fat and almost ugly lady, I didn't understand what he saw in her, and Diamond, Munir's code name, a short, sturdy, and broad-shouldered man with a serious face. They didn't know they were being tested. Only when he was convinced that he could trust Diamond did Amit give Rehaviavardi the order to proceed with the next stage, briefing the Iraqi pilot in Israel. Liran and Redfa returned to Athens to catch a flight to Tel Aviv. But a snag at Athens airport almost ruined the operation. By mistake, Redfa boarded a flight to Cairo instead of Tel Aviv. Only when he boarded the LL flight did Liran realize that Redfa had vanished. "I was desperate," Liran reported later. "I was certain that everything was lost. But a few minutes later, Munir appeared beside me. It turned out that the flight attendants in the Cairo plane counted the passengers, found out that there was an extra passenger, checked the tickets, and sent Munir to the Tel Aviv flight." Redfa spent only 24 hours in Israel. He was briefed, and even rehearsed the flight itinerary into Israel. In a Mossad compound, he was taught a secret code. His new friends then took him on a stroll down Allenby Street, one of Tel Aviv's main arteries, and in the evening hosted him in a fine restaurant in Jaffa, to make him feel at home. Redfa flew back to Athens, changed planes, and landed in Baghdad, in preparation for the last stage. But at that moment, I almost got a heart attack, Amit recalled. A few days before his desertion, the Iraqi pilot decided to sell his home furniture. Now try to imagine the implications of a sudden garage sale by a fighter pilot. I was scared to death that the Iraqi Mukhabarat security service would find out about the sale, would interrogate Redfa, arrest him, and the entire operation would collapse. Thank God, the Mukhabarat didn't hear about that, and the stupid sale of this miser's belongings didn't lead to his arrest. Then, another problem: how to get the pilot's family out of Iraq, first to England and later to the United States. He had quite a few sisters and brothers-in-law that had to be taken out of Iraq before he flew. His immediate family, it had been agreed, would be flown to Israel. Redfa's wife didn't know a thing about this, and he was afraid to tell her the truth. He had only told her that they were going to Europe for a long stay. She flew with her 2 children to Amsterdam. Mossad people waiting there took them on to Paris, where Liran met them. She still had no idea who these people were. They were settled in a small apartment with 1 double bed, Liran recalled. We sat on this bed, and there, on the night before the flight to Israel, I revealed to her that I was an Israeli officer, that her husband would land in Israel the next day, and that we are going there as well. Her reaction was dramatic. She wept and yelled all night, Liran reported to his superiors. She said that her husband was a traitor, that this was treason against Iraq, and her brothers would kill Munir when they found out what he had done. She wanted to go right away to the Iraqi embassy and tell them what her husband intended to do. She didn't stop screaming and crying all night long. I tried to calm her down. I told her that if she wanted to see him, she had to come to Israel with me. She realized she had no other choice. With swollen eyes and a sick child, she got on the plane and we flew to Israel. On July 17, 1966, one of the Mossad stations in Europe got a coded letter from Munir, informing them that his flight was approaching. On August 14, he took off, but a malfunction in the aircraft's electric system made him turn back and land at Rashid Air Base. Later, Amit said, he found out that it was not a serious hitch. The cockpit suddenly filled with smoke because of a burned fuse. If he stayed the course, he would have arrived without any problem. But he didn't want to take risks and returned to base, and I got some more white hairs. 2 days later, Munir Redfa took off again. He stuck to the planned route, and on the Israeli radar screens a dot appeared, indicating the approach of a foreign aircraft to Israel's airspace. The new Air Force commander, General Mordecai Mahdi Had, had let only a couple of pilots in on the mission. They would escort the Iraqi plane to their base. All the other units, pilots, squadrons, and bases of the Air Force were given an order by Had: today you don't do anything, but absolutely anything, without a verbal order from me. And you know my voice. Had didn't want some overzealous pilot to shoot down the enemy aircraft breaching Israel's perimeter. The MiG-21 penetrated into Israel's airspace. Ran Pecker, one of the aces of the Air Force, had been chosen to escort Redfa. Our guest is slowing down, Ran reported to Air Force Control, and signals me with his thumb that he wants to land. He also tilts his wings, which is the international code indicating that he comes in peace. At 8 a.m., 65 minutes after taking off from Baghdad, Redfa landed in the Hatzor Air Base in Israel. A year after the operation started, and 10 months before the 1967 Six-Day War, the Air Force got its MiG-21. The 2 Mirage fighters that had escorted it from the border landed with it. Mayor Amit and his men had accomplished the impossible. The MiG-21, which at that time was considered the crown jewel of the Soviet arsenal and was regarded as the main threat to Western air forces, was now in Israel's hands. After he landed, still stunned and confused, Munir was taken to the home of the Hatzor base commander. Several senior officers threw him a party, with inexcusable disregard for the man's feelings. Munir was surprised by the party and at first felt as if he had strayed into another man's wedding, Mayor Amit recalled. He sat down in a corner and kept quiet. After a short rest, when he was assured that his wife and children were already on an El Al plane on the way to Israel, Munir Redfa was taken to a press conference. In his statement, he spoke about the persecution of Christians in Iraq, the bombing of the Kurds, and his own reasons for defection. After the press conference, Munir was driven to Herzliya, an oceanfront city north of Tel Aviv, to meet his family. "We did our best to calm him down, encourage him, and compliment him for the operation," Mayor Amit wrote. "I promised him to do all in my power to help him and his family to recover, but I feared the next stage, as we had learned that Munir's family was very problematic." A few days after Munir had landed his MiG in Hatzor, his wife's brother, an officer in the Iraqi army, arrived in Israel. He was accompanied by Shemesh and his lover, Camille. The officer was mad with rage. He had been told that he had to urgently visit his sister, who was very sick, in Europe, and to his amazement, he was taken to Israel. When he met with Munir, he blew his top, called him a traitor, jumped him, and tried to beat him up. He also accused his sister, Munir's wife, of being aware of her husband's plans all along, which made her an accomplice to an unspeakable crime. She denied his accusations, but in vain. A few days later, the brother left Israel. The first to fly the MiG was Danny Shapira, a famous Air Force pilot and the best test pilot in Israel. Madi Hod called him the day after the plane's landing and told him, "You're going to be the first Western pilot to fly a MiG-21. Start studying this aircraft, fly it as much as you can, and learn its strengths and its flaws." Shapira met with Redfa. "We met in Herzliya a few days after his arrival," Danny Shapira said. "When they introduced us, he almost jumped to attention. Later we met in Hatzor, by the plane. He showed me the switches, we went over the labels that were in Russian and Arabic, and after an hour I told him that I was going to fly the plane. He was amazed. He said, 'But you haven't completed a course.' I explained that I was a test pilot. He seemed very worried and asked to be beside the plane when I took off. I promised." All the senior officers of the Air Force came to Hatzor to watch the maiden flight. Ezer Weizman, until recently the Air Force commander, was also there. "Ezer came to me," Shapira remembered, patted my shoulder, and said, "Danny, no tricks, bring the aircraft back, okay?" Redfa was also there. I took off, did what I did, and after I landed, Redfa came to me and hugged me. He had tears in his eyes. "With pilots like you," he said, "the Arabs will never beat you." After a few test flights, the Air Force experts understood why the West held the MiG-21 in such esteem. It flew very high and very fast and weighed a ton less than the French and Israeli Mirage 3. The MiG-21 operation made the headlines of the world press. The Americans were amazed. Soon after, they sent a delegation of technicians and asked to study and fly the aircraft. Israel, however, refused to let them near the plane before the United States shared with it its files on the SAM-2, the new Soviet anti-aircraft missile. The Americans finally agreed. American pilots came to Israel, examined the MiG-21, and flew it. Learning the secrets of the MiG-21 was a tremendous help to the Israeli Air Force and was essential in preparing for the confrontations with the MiGs that finally occurred 10 months later, in the Six-Day War of June 1967. That MiG had an important part in the victory of the Israeli Air Force over the Arab air forces, and in particular in the destruction of the Egyptian Air Force in a few hours, Amit proudly said. The Mossad and the Israeli Air Force had indeed achieved a tremendous victory, but Munir Redfa and his family paid dearly for it. After his arrival, Munir had a very hard, miserable, and sad life, a senior Mossad officer said. Building a new life for an agent, out of his country, is almost a mission impossible. Munir felt frustrated, but his family suffered, too. A whole family was broken. For 3 years, Munir tried to make Israel his home, and even flew Dakota aircrafts for the Israeli oil companies to the Sinai and back. His family lived in Tel Aviv. They were given a cover, as Iranian refugees. But Munir's wife, a devout Catholic, was unable to make friends, felt isolated, and couldn't adapt to life in Israel. They finally left and moved to a Western country under false identities. Even there, far from home and relatives, surrounded by local security agents, they felt lonely and feared the long arm of the Iraqi Mukhabarat. In August 1988, 22 years after his desertion, Munir Redfa died at his home of a sudden heart attack. His wife, in tears, called Mayor Amit, who had long ago left the Mossad, and told him that earlier that morning, her husband had come down from the second floor of their house and, while standing next to their son, suddenly collapsed in the entrance hall and died instantly. The Mossad held a memorial service for Munir Redfa. Veteran officers couldn't hold back their tears. It was a surreal sight, Liran said. The Israeli Mossad mourns an Iraqi pilot. Following the success of Operation Diamond and the subsequent astounding victory in the Six-Day War, Mayor Amit saw an opportunity to launch a new operation. He requested that his superiors demand the release of the Lavon Affair prisoners as part of a POW exchange. The young captives had been rotting in prison for 13 years, with no chance of pardon or early release. Israel, Amit felt, seemed to have forgotten them. Now that the Six-Day War was over, Israel was in negotiations with Egypt. Israel had captured 4,338 Egyptian soldiers and 830 civilians, while Egypt only captured 11 Israelis. Yet the Egyptians firmly refused to include the Lavon Affair prisoners in the deal. Mayor Amit wouldn't let go. "Forget about it, Mayor," Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan told his friend. "The Egyptians will never release them." Prime Minister Eshkol agreed. But Amit refused to give up. He finally sent a personal note to President Nasser, as a soldier to a soldier, and demanded the prisoners' release, as well as that of Wolfgang Lutz, the Champagne spy, who had been arrested during the German scientist's affair. Amit negotiated for a prisoner exchange with the Syrians as well. He had a personal stake in this negotiation. He asked the Syrians to help release Mrs. Shula Cohen from her Lebanese jail. Shula Cohen, codenamed the Pearl, was one of the legendary Mossad spies. A simple housewife, she had established relations with high-placed leaders in Lebanon and Syria, organized the clandestine emigration of thousands of Syrian and Lebanese Jews, and directed a highly successful spy ring. To his amazement, his plea to Nasser worked, and the Syrians followed suit soon after. Mayor Amit won. In a covert transaction, the Lavon Affair prisoners, Lutz, and Shula Cohen were returned to Israel. Sometimes the missions to bring home a nation's own are the most meaningful. Episode 11. Those Who'll Never Forget. In early September 1964, a bald, sturdy man in his mid-40s, wearing sunglasses, arrived in the Rotterdam railway station in Holland on the express train from Paris. He checked into the luxurious Rien Hotel in the city center under the name Anton Kunzel, an Austrian businessman. He then went to the nearby post office and rented a P.O. box under the same name. From the post office, he went to Amro Bank, opened an account, and deposited $3,000. At a printer's shop, he ordered business cards and stationery in the name of Anton Kunzel, manager of an investment company in Rotterdam. From there, he hurried to the Brazilian consulate and filled out forms for a tourist visa to Brazil. At a doctor's clinic, he underwent a perfunctory checkup and got a medical certificate about his health, then visited an optometrist, cheated during the test, and ordered thick magnifying glasses, even though he didn't need them at all. The following morning, he made a short trip to Zurich and opened an account in the Credit Suisse Bank, in which he deposited $6,000. Then he returned to Paris, where a makeup artist attached a bushy mustache to his face. A photographer took his pictures with his new glasses and handed him a set of passport photos. Back in Rotterdam, he brought the photos to the visa clerk at the Brazilian consulate, and the tourist visa to Brazil was stamped in his Austrian passport. Now he could buy his plane tickets to Rio de Janeiro and, from there, to Sao Paulo and Montevideo, in Uruguay. Wherever he went, the loquacious Kunzel spoke of his flourishing business in Austria. The generous tips that he spread on his way, his choice of the best hotels and the most exclusive restaurants spoke for themselves. Kunzel, indeed, was a rich and successful businessman. By these seemingly simple actions, Mossad agent Yitzhak Sered, not his real name, built a foolproof cover for himself. Somewhere between Paris, Rotterdam, and Zurich, Yitzhak Sered evaporated into thin air and a new man emerged in his stead, Anton Kunzel, an Austrian businessman, with an address in Rotterdam, bank accounts, business cards, a visa, and a plane ticket to Brazil. Only a few days earlier, on September 1st, Yitzhak Sered had been summoned to a meeting in Paris. Sered was a member of the Mossad operational team codenamed Caesarea. In a safe house on Avenue de Versailles, he met with Caesarea's commander, Yosky Yariv, a sturdy, muscular man admired by his subordinates. Yariv, a former army officer, had replaced Rafi Eitan as the head of the operational team. Eitan had been appointed head of Europe Station, based in Paris. Yariv started by saying that in a few months, the West German parliament would adopt a statute of limitations regarding war crimes, which meant that Nazi criminals, living now undercover, would be able to re-emerge from hiding and resume normal lives, as if they had never committed their atrocious acts. Yariv said that many Germans wanted to turn the page and leave Germany's horrid past behind them. Even other nations that had suffered under the Germans were not eager to keep searching for Nazi criminals. Since Eichmann's capture 4 years before, awareness about Nazi crimes had diminished, as if Eichmann's trial and execution had closed a chapter in the world's history. It was imperative, Yariv said, to make sure that the statute of limitations on Nazi crimes did not become law. The world needed to be reminded that monsters were still at large. "We should kill one of the greatest Nazi criminals," Yariv said to Sered. And a Mossad agent on a mission in South America had found the one. The butcher of Riga, a Latvian Nazi, guilty of massacring 30,000 Jews, had been positively identified. He was living in Brazil under his real name, Herberts Kukers. The Ramsad, Mayor Amit, had given the green light for the operation. Yariv now turned to Sered. And not only because of Sered's record as a smart and resourceful agent, who had participated in the Eichmann operation. He also knew Sered was born in Germany, and both his parents had died in the Holocaust. Sered had escaped to Palestine, but had sworn to fight Hitler and had been one of the first Palestinian volunteers in the British Army during the war. Yariv did not have to worry about Sered's motivation. "I want you to build yourself a cover as an Austrian businessman," the Caesarea commander said to Sered. "Your job will be to fly to Brazil, find Kukers, and win his confidence. That is the first step toward his execution." In the detailed briefing that followed, Yariv gave Sered his new name, Anton Kunzel. 10 days after the meeting in Paris, Anton Kunzel boarded a Varig plane to Rio de Janeiro. He was excited and yet troubled by his mission. He had never been in such a situation before. He had to operate, completely alone, in a foreign country, and try making friends with a monster with sharp senses who certainly expected that one day somebody would try to kill him. Kunzel knew well that a single mistake could cause the failure of the entire operation. Just one misstep could cost him his life. During the flight, Kunzel perused a voluminous file of documents, testimonies, and press cuttings about Herberts Kukers. He had become famous in the 30s as a gifted and bold pilot, who had flown from Latvia to Gambia, in Africa, in a small plane he had built with his own hands. Overnight, the young, handsome pilot had become a national hero in Latvia. He was awarded the International Santos Dumont Medal in honor of the Brazilian aviation pioneer. The press called him the Eagle of Latvia and the Latvian Lindbergh. The War Museum in Riga was assailed by multitudes eager to see Kukers's plane, on display there. Kukers was a right-wing Latvian nationalist, yet he had many Jewish friends. He even traveled to Palestine and came back deeply impressed by the Zionists' achievements. His enthusiastic speeches about the pioneers in Palestine made him seem an ally to Latvian Jews. Yet when World War II erupted, things suddenly changed. Latvia was first occupied by the Soviets, who quickly won the people's hatred and who persecuted those like Kukers. But the Red Army retreated after Hitler's invasion of Russia, and Latvia was conquered by the German army. Kukers now transformed completely. As staunch nationalist and a leader of the fanatic fascist organization Thunder Cross that volunteered to serve the Nazis, Kukers became the most cruel and sadistic murderer of the Riga Jews. Early on, he and his soldiers herded 300 Jews into a local synagogue and set it on fire, murdering everyone inside. He arrested Jews, beat them to death with his revolver, shot hundreds of others, humiliated and killed Orthodox Jews, smashed babies' heads on the city walls. One night, he made a Jewish girl undress in front of a group of Jewish prisoners, then forced an old rabbi to stroke and lick her, to the drunken laughter of the Latvian guards. In the summer, he ordered the drowning of 1,200 Jews in the Kuldīga Lake, and in November 1941, he led 30,000 Riga Jews to the killing field in the Rumbula forests, where they were undressed by German soldiers and shot in cold blood. Reading the depositions of some Jews who miraculously survived, Kunzel was deeply shocked. The documents in the file described Kukers's flight to France with forged papers at the end of the war. Posing as a farmer, he managed to get on a boat bound for Rio de Janeiro. He took with him a strange insurance policy, a young Jewish girl, Miriam Kietzner, whom he had protected during the war. Miriam, who served as his champion now, was speaking throughout Brazil about her noble savior from Riga. In Rio, Kukers quickly established warm relations with many Brazilian Jews. He loved describing to his audiences Miriam's fascinating story. "The Nazis caught her in Latvia," he used to say. "She was to die a horrible death, but I saved her, risking my life." Such a valiant hero and a savior of Jews didn't come to Rio every day, and the city Jews did their best to show the brave Latvian how much they valued his noble deeds. Kukers became very popular in the Jewish community, till the night when the brave Latvian had too much to drink. The alcohol loosened his tongue, and the inebriated Kukers told now a very different story to his audience. He spoke of Jews indeed, but now he called them pigs and scum. He spoke with enthusiasm of the means he and his Nazi friends had used to slaughter the Jews of Europe, of Jews who were burned, drowned, shot, and beaten to death. The Latvians' Jewish friends were stupefied. They started investigating, and the results of their research were horrifying. When his real identity was exposed, Kukers vanished. He didn't leave Rio, only moved to a distant neighborhood of the sprawling city. He abandoned Miriam Kietzner, whom he didn't need anymore. Miriam would later marry a local Jew and assimilate in the Brazilian society. As for Kukers, he brought over his wife and 3 sons. 10 years went by. Kukers had become the respected owner of the air taxi company. But then, by chance, he was discovered again by the Rio Jewish community. They marched to raise public awareness. Students broke into the air taxi offices, smashed windows, destroyed equipment, and emptied files. Kukers left Rio with his family right away and settled in São Paulo. Even though nobody bothered him there, Kukers felt he was still in danger. He was haunted by fears and suspected every approaching stranger. In June 1960, a few days after Eichmann's capture, Kukers came to police headquarters in São Paulo and asked for police protection. His request was granted, but it was also publicized in the media, and relatives of Kukers's victims all over the world now knew where he lived. As years passed, Kukers's fears only grew. He told his wife and sons that Jewish avengers could discover his whereabouts and come to murder him at any time. He even prepared a list of his most dangerous enemies, most of them important Brazilian Jews from Rio. At the top of the list were Dr. Aaron Steinbruck, a senator, Dr. Alfredo Gartenberg, Dr. Marcus Constantino, Dr. Israel Skolnikov, Mr. Klinger, Mr. Peritsky. Kukers kept his real name, but built his houses like fortresses and apparently paid substantial bribes for protection by the police and the security services. He launched several business ventures, but they all failed. According to Kunzel's file, his last address was a marina on an artificial lake outside Sao Paulo. Kukers used to rent a few boats and take tourists on aerial promenades over the city in his seaplane. Kunzel knew well that if he tried to approach Kukers directly, he would certainly arouse his suspicions, so, first, he spent a few days in Rio. His stay in the stunning Brazilian city stood in sheer contrast to the dark mission he had undertaken. He walked on the Copacabana and Ipanema beaches, staring at mulatto beauties in minimal bikinis, gazed at the breathtaking sugarloaf and the huge statue of Christ on top of the Corcovado, watched a macumba, the Brazilian voodoo, ceremony, absorbed the warm sunshine and the rhythms of samba. He was a typical tourist, but he got acquainted with several senior officials and private investors in the tourism business, met with the local minister of tourism, and introduced himself as an investor interested in tourist enterprises in Brazil. He got a few letters of recommendation to major figures in the tourism business in Sao Paulo. Kunzel arrived in Sao Paulo and immediately found Kukers's marina. By the pier, a little apart from the pleasure boats, he saw an old seaplane and, beside it, a tall, lean man wearing a pilot's overalls. Herbert's Kukers. Kunzel approached the pretty German girl who sold tickets for Kukers's boat excursions, and asked her for information about tourism in that area. He didn't know then that the young woman was the wife of Kukers's oldest son. She admitted she didn't know very much about tourism, but pointed at the man in the overalls. "Ask him, he will help you." Kunzel walked to the pilot and introduced himself as an Austrian investor. He asked a few professional questions and Kukers reluctantly answered, but his attitude changed when Kunzel asked to hire him and his plane for a tour over the city. A few minutes later, they were high in the air. The two men had a long, friendly chat. Kunzel knew how to make friends. On their return, Kukers invited him to his boat, for a shot of brandy. While they were drinking, Kukers suddenly erupted in a furious diatribe against his accusers. "I was a war criminal?" he shouted. "I saved a Jewish girl during the war." Kunzel suspected that Kukers's indignation was fake and the Latvian only wanted to provoke his reaction. "Did you serve in the war?" Kukers asked. "Yes," Kunzel said, "on the Russian front." But the tone of his answer seemed to indicate the opposite, to imply that Kunzel had served in the army but certainly not on the Russian front. He also unbuttoned his shirt and showed Kukers a chest scar. "From the war," he said, without elaborating. Kunzel made a quick assessment of his host. Kukers was in a bad economic situation: the frayed overalls, the ramshackle plane, the sorry state of the boats, all of which indicated a low standard of living. Kunzel realized that he had to make Kukers believe that he, Kunzel, was his chance to overcome his troubles. He was the man who could bring him large profits. He therefore kept talking about his company and his partners, and their grandiose projects to invest a lot of money in tourism in Latin America. He hinted that Kukers could perhaps join their group, as he knew the Brazilian tourist scene well. Kukers seemed interested in his guest's words, but Kunzel suddenly got on his feet. "Well," he said, "I shouldn't be bothering you anymore. You must be very busy." "No, not at all," Kukers said, and suggested that Kunzel come to his home one of these days, after work, so that we could discuss our common interests. The contact was established. The bait was cast. Now Kukers should be persuaded to swallow it. That evening, Kunzel dispatched a coded telegram to Yaski Uriv. For the first time, he used the code name that Uriv had chosen for Kukers, the deceased. Kukers, too, did some writing that night. He took the list of his most dangerous enemies and added another name to it: Anton Kunzel. A week later, a taxi stopped by a house in the Riviera neighborhood in Sao Paulo. The house was modest but protected like a fortress. It was surrounded by a wall and barbed wire. The entrance was barred by an iron gate, and beside it stood a young man and a fierce-looking dog. Kunzel asked the youngster, who turned out to be one of Kukers's sons, to inform the pilot of his arrival. Kukers welcomed him warmly, walked him through the house, introduced him to his wife, Milda, then pulled out a drawer and showed Kunzel about 15 medals from the war days. Many of them were adorned by a swastika. Kukers opened another drawer and showed the amazed Kunzel his private armory, 3 heavy revolvers and a semi-automatic rifle. Kukers proudly revealed that the Brazilian Secret Service had given him permits for all these weapons. "I know how to defend myself," he added. Kunzel took Kukers's words as a veiled threat. "If you try to hurt me," his host seemed to say, "you should know that I am armed and dangerous." Kukers suddenly had an idea. "Why don't you come with me on a trip to my farms? They are in the country, we can spend a night there." Kunzel readily agreed. But on his way to his hotel, he stopped at a hardware store and bought a switchblade. Just in case. A few days later, the two of them got into Kunzel's rented car and headed for the mountains. It was an eerie, tense trip. Here was Anton Kunzel, armed only with a knife, fearing Kukers and yet determined to tempt him with the prospects of easy money, and lead him to his death. And sitting in the car beside him was Herbert's Kukers, strong, sober, but poor, suspicious of his new friend, armed with a heavy handgun but unable to resist the bait Kunzel was dangling before him. Kunzel thought that perhaps he was the victim in this cat-and-mouse game, perhaps Kukers did not believe his cover story, perhaps he was taking him to the mountains to murder him there? Along the way, they visited a neglected farm. All of a sudden, Kukers drew his semi-automatic rifle out of his bag. Kunzel started. Why did Kukers bring over both a handgun and a rifle? What about a shooting contest? Kukers asked him. Kunzel understood right away. Kukers wanted to test his abilities as a former fighter on the Russian front and see if he knew how to shoot. The Latvian fixed a paper target to a tree, loaded his rifle, and fired 10 bullets in rapid succession. The hits formed a cluster 10 centimeters in diameter. Kukers took from his bag a second paper target, loaded the rifle again, and handed it to Kunzel. A veteran of the British Army and the IDF, Kunzel was an excellent marksman. He picked up the weapon and without any delay fired 10 bullets, making a cluster of 3 centimeters. Kukers nodded with approval. "Excellent, Herr Anton," he said. The two of them got back in the car and traveled to a second farm. It was much larger, and included a dense forest and a river, where alligators lazily lingered. Kukers led the way into the forest, and Kunzel again was assailed by fears. Was this a trap? Did Kukers bring him here so he could murder him without leaving evidence? He kept walking at Kukers's side. All of a sudden, he stepped on a rock, a nail got loose in his shoe and deeply punctured his heel. Doubling over in pain, Kunzel kneeled and removed his shoe. Blood was dripping from a wound in his heel. Kukers bent over him and drew his gun. Kunzel was exposed, completely defenseless. That's it, he thought, his last moment had arrived. The Latvian would shoot him as a dog. But Kukers handed him the gun. "Use the butt," he said, "hammer it down." Kunzel took the gun. All of a sudden, the roles were reversed. They were all alone in a mountain farm. There was not a living soul for miles around. The gun was loaded. He could terminate Kukers that very moment. Just point the gun and press the trigger. Instead, he bent down and forcefully pounded the nail's sharp end, then returned the gun to its owner. At nightfall, the two of them reached a ramshackle hut and improvised dinner with some food they had brought with them. They spread their sleeping bags on 2 old iron beds. Kunzel saw Kukers slipping his gun under his pillow. Troubled by ominous thoughts, he pulled his knife out of his pocket and held it ready, but he couldn't sleep. In the middle of the night, he heard a noise coming from Kukers's bed. The Nazi got up, took his gun, and quietly stepped out. Why? Kunzel thought. He tried to listen to the sounds outside, and suddenly he heard an easily recognizable noise. Cukers was standing outside and urinating. There were probably wild animals prowling around. The following day, they returned, safe and sound, to Sao Paulo. Kunzel let out a sigh of relief when he walked into his hotel. During the following week, Kunzel invited Cukers to gourmet restaurants, expensive nightclubs, and bars. He noticed Cukers' hungry stare and realized that it had been years since the man last tasted all those pleasures that money could buy. His next move was to ask Cukers to join him in several domestic flights, on Kunzel's expense account, of course. They visited some major tourist locations, and Cukers enjoyed the best food and lodging. Now Kunzel suggested that they flew to Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay. His partners, he said, wanted to establish their South American business center there, and he wanted to check the availability of office buildings and other facilities. He even paid for Cukers' new passport. Kunzel flew to Montevideo, and a few days later, Cukers joined him. But the Latvian's suspicions had not faded away. He had brought his camera. As he came out of the plane in Montevideo airport, he saw Kunzel, who was waiting for him. Cukers took out his camera and snapped several photos of Kunzel, catching him by surprise. His friend, his partner, and his funder had become in Cukers' eyes the major suspect in a plot to assassinate him. In the meantime, Kunzel had rented a big American car. He was quite embarrassed by its color, shocking pink, but that was the only car available at the rental agency. He also had reserved rooms for both of them in the best hotel in town, the Victoria Plaza. They spent a few days in Montevideo, looking for a building that could serve as headquarters for Kunzel's company. They didn't find a place, but enjoyed a dreamlike vacation. Again, Kunzel invited Cukers to the best restaurants, took him to nightclubs, on sightseeing tours, to the casino, where he shared his winnings with his guest. Cukers was delighted. Finally they parted, and Kunzel left for Europe, after promising Cukers he would be back in a few months to continue developing their project. Cukers went back to Sao Paulo, but told his wife that in Montevideo somebody had been following him, so now he had to stay alert and be ready to defend himself. In Paris, Kunzel again met Urive and his friends, and they immediately started to prepare the operation. It was decided that Cukers would be executed in Montevideo, for a few reasons. In Brazil, Cukers was protected by the local police, and that could create some problems. In Brazil, the large Jewish community was vulnerable to attacks by neo-Nazis or Germans seeking revenge. And finally, Brazil still had the death penalty, and if a hit team was caught and tried, they could be killed. The hit team consisted of 5 agents and was headed by Yaski Urive himself. One of the agents was Zaev Amit Slutsky, a cousin of the Mossad, Mayor Amit. The other members were Kunzel, Ari Cohen, not his real name, and Eliezer Sudit, Sharon, who also got an Austrian passport in the name of Oswald Tausig. The team members arrived in Montevideo in February 1965. Oswald Tausig rented a green Volkswagen. He also rented a small house, the Casa Cubertini, on Cartagena Street, in the Carrasco neighborhood. At the last moment, Urive charged him with a chilling task, to buy a large trunk, like the travel trunks that were used in the 19th century. The trunk would be used as a makeshift coffin for the Nazi's body when the operation was over. Kunzel invited Cukers to Montevideo again. On February 15, 1965, Cukers went to police headquarters and was received by an officer, Alcido Sintra Bueno Filho. "I am a businessman," the Latvian said. "For several years I've been under the protection of the Brazilian police, because I have good reason to fear for my life. Now a European business partner is asking me to travel to Montevideo to meet him. What do you think? Can I travel to Uruguay? Isn't it risky?" "Don't go," the officer firmly said. "Here you live in peace because we protect you. But don't forget, the moment you leave Brazil, you aren't protected anymore. You expose yourself to your enemies. And if you've got enemies, I assume that they haven't forgotten you." Kukers thought a while, seemed to hesitate, but finally got up and said, "I was always a brave man. I am not afraid. I know how to defend my life. I always carry a gun. And believe me, in spite of all the years that have passed, I am still a fine shot." Kunzel met Kukers in Montevideo on February 23. The trap was set. Kunzel drove Kukers in a rented black Volkswagen toward the Casa Cubertini, where the hit team was waiting. On the way, they stopped several times to check some other houses that could serve as an office for the company. Finally, they reached the Casa Cubertini. They saw some men at work, repairing the neighboring house. Tausig's green car, also a Volkswagen, was parked by the house. Kunzel turned off the engine, got out of the car, and walked purposefully toward the door. Kukers followed him. Kunzel opened the door and saw a terrifying sight. In the dark house, the members of the hit team stood by the walls, wearing only their drawers. They knew they couldn't overcome Kukers without a bloody fight, and had undressed so their clothes wouldn't be soiled by his blood. There was something appalling in that sight of a group of people in drawers, waiting in the dark for their victim. Kunzel moved aside and Kukers entered the house. As soon as he stepped in, Kunzel slammed the door behind him. 3 men leaped on Kukers. Zaev Amit tried to grab him by the throat, as he had been trained in Paris. The others jumped him from both sides. The Latvian fought back. He succeeded in shaking off his attackers and made for the door. He yanked the door handle, then tried to draw the gun he was carrying in his pocket, while shouting in German, "Lassen Sie Michigan sprechen." "Let me speak." During the fight, Yuriv tried to cover Kukers' mouth with his hand, to prevent him from shouting. Kukers fiercely bit his hand and almost tore off one of Yuriv's fingers. Yuriv cried in pain. At that moment, Amit grabbed a heavy construction hammer and landed a blow on Kukers' head. Blood spurted from the wound. The bodies of the attackers and their victim turned into a convulsing heap on the floor, while Kukers desperately tried to draw his gun. It was a matter of seconds. Erai pressed his gun to Kukers' head and fired twice. The silencer muffled the sound of the shots. Kukers' body collapsed. His blood flowed on his clothes and the floor tiles. The hit team members were covered with blood. Oswald Tausig hurried to the yard and turned on the main water pipe. His friends washed the blood off their bodies, then cleaned the floor and the walls, yet some large bloodstains remained on the house tiles. One of the members of the hit team claimed afterward that their intention had been to capture Kukers alive and make him stand for an improvised court-martial before executing him. But flawed planning or a gross underestimation of the Latvians' physical strength turned the mission into a repulsive bloodbath that was unplanned and unnecessary. The Mossad agent had rented the house on Cartagena Street at the very last moment. The travel trunk was bought at the last moment as well. Instead of jumping their victim in their drawers, the Mossad agents could have shot him right away. But, as some of the hit team members told us, the mission was accomplished. The agents placed Kukers' body in the trunk, to make the police believe that they intended to abduct him and smuggle him out of Uruguay. Then they left a typewritten letter in English on the body, which had been prepared beforehand, considering the gravity of the crimes of which Herberts Kukers was accused, notably his personal responsibility in the murder of 30,000 men, women, and children, and considering the terrible cruelty shown by Herberts Kukers in carrying out his crimes, we condemn the said Kukers to death. The accused was executed on February 23, 1965, by those who will never forget. The team left the building and departed in the 2 rented Volkswagens. In the neighboring house, the workmen kept pounding and hammering. They had not heard a thing. Yuriv suffered terrible pain in his hand. Till his death, he wouldn't be able to properly use one of his fingers. Tausig and Kunzel returned the cars and left their hotels. The entire team left Montevideo and went back by complex routes to Europe and to Israel. Zaev Amit returned to Paris, wounded in his body and hurt in his soul. Terrible nightmares haunted him for many months and he couldn't overcome his shock and pain. When all the hit team members had left Latin America, a Mossad agent called the news agencies in Germany and reported the execution of a Nazi criminal in Montevideo by those who will never forget. The reporters who got the message discarded it right away, believing it was a prank. Seeing that nothing happened, the Mossad agents prepared a much more detailed and credible message and dispatched it to the news agencies and to a reporter in a Montevideo newspaper, who alerted the police. On March 8, more than 10 days after Cukers was killed, the police finally arrived at Casa Cubertini. The next day, the world press announced, in banner headlines, the discovery of Cukers's body in an empty house in Montevideo. In the media reports, two names were singled out as suspects in the killing, Anton Kunzel and Oswald Tausig. A few days later, a Rio de Janeiro weekly published a huge photo of Anton Kunzel that had been taken by Cukers. The magazine called Kunzel the Smiling Austrian. The photo was reproduced on the front page of the Israel newspaper Ma'ariv. Some friends of the Mossad agent immediately identified Anton Kunzel. After a few more days, a letter arrived to Cukers's house. It was a rather poor effort by Anton Kunzel to cover his tracks. My dear Herberts, with God's help and that of some of our compatriots, I have safely reached Chile. I am now resting after a tiring journey, and I am sure that you, too, will very soon be back home. Meanwhile, I've discovered that we were followed by two people, a man and a woman. We must be very careful and take every precaution. As I've always said, you are running a great risk in working and traveling under your own name. It could be disastrous for us, and also lead to my real identity being discovered. So I hope that the complications in Uruguay have taught you a lesson for the future, and that you'll be more prudent now. If you notice anything suspicious in or around your house, remember the advice I gave you. Go and hide among von Leeds's men, a Nazi leader who had escaped to Cairo with a group of German exiles, for a year or two, until the question of an amnesty is settled. When you get this letter, reply to the address you know of, in Santiago, Chile. Yours, Anton K. The letter, of course, did not fool anybody. Cukers's wife, Milda, was adamant, Kunzel was the murderer. Most of the participants in the Cukers killing are dead. Zeev Amit, whom the authors of this book knew well, was killed in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Their mission paid off. The parliaments of Germany and Austria rejected the statute of limitation on the Nazi crimes. Years later, former Ramsad Isser Harel called one of the authors of this book and told him that a good friend of his wanted to meet. He didn't give any details, just an address in North Tel Aviv. The author found there a neat little house. A sturdy, bald man wearing glasses opened the door. The author recognized him right away. He said to the man, "Guten Abend, Herr Kunzel." Episode 12. The Quest for the Red Prince. On September 5, 1972, at 4:30 a.m., 8 armed terrorists wearing ski masks broke into the apartment of the Israeli team at the Munich Olympics. They killed Moshe Weinberg, the coach of the wrestling team, who tried to bar their way, and Joe Romano, a weightlifting champion. A few athletes, awakened by the shouts and the gunfire, escaped by jumping out the windows. 9 were taken hostage by the terrorists. The German police arrived, followed by reporters, photographers, and television crews that covered the drama unfolding in the Olympic Village. For the first time in history, the whole world watched a murderous terrorist attack in live broadcast on its television screens. So, too, did Golda Meir, Israel's prime minister, who was awakened by her military adjutant. Golda felt trapped. The attack happened in a friendly country and the responsibility for rescuing the hostages fell on Germany's shoulders. The authorities of the state of Bavaria, where the attack had occurred, politely rejected Israel's suggestion to send over Sayeret Matkal, the best Israeli commando unit. "You have nothing to worry about," the Germans said to the Israeli representatives, "we shall free all the hostages." But Germany lacked the experience, the creativity, and the courage to face a deadly, cunning terrorist organization. After an exhausting negotiation between the terrorists and the German authorities, which lasted a whole day, the terrorists and the hostages were driven to Fürstenfeldbruck Airport, outside Munich. There, the Germans had promised the terrorists they would board a plane that would take them to the destination of their choice. But the police actually had laid a childish and amateurish trap at the airport. They had hauled an empty and unmanned Lufthansa aircraft to the center of the airport. Incompetent sharpshooters had been placed on the roofs. The terrorists' leader came to inspect the plane. That plane, with no air crew, its engines cold, was going to take off in a few minutes? The terrorists right away realized they were being deceived. They opened fire and threw hand grenades. During the ensuing shootout with the police, they murdered all the hostages. A German police officer was also killed, as well as 5 of the 8 terrorists. The other 3 would be captured, but released shortly afterward, following the hijacking of a Lufthansa aircraft by the terrorist organization. Israeli General Zvi Zamir, who had recently replaced Meir Amit as Ramsad, helplessly watched the bloody drama from the control tower. He had been sent to Munich by Prime Minister Golda Meir, but had no right to interfere with the German operation. His hosts kept assuring him that their plan was excellent, and he just had to watch and see. What the Ramsad saw was the massacre of the Israeli athletes. He now realized that Israel had a new enemy, a terrorist organization that called itself Black September. Black September. That was how the Palestinian terrorists had renamed September 1970, the month when King Hussein of Jordan had massacred thousands of them in his kingdom. In the years that had passed since the 1967 Six-Day War, the terrorists gradually had gained control over large chunks of Jordanian territory and many neighborhoods in the capital, Amman. Towns and villages along the Israeli border became their exclusive bases, and they would wander in their streets with their weapons. They rejected King Hussein's authority and step by step had become the real masters of Jordan. The king knew this, but didn't do anything. In one of his visits to an army camp, he saw a brazier flying like a flag from a tank antenna. "What's this?" he angrily inquired. "This means that we are women," the male tank commander replied. "You don't let us fight." Finally, Hussein could take that no more. He could not continue burying his head in the sand like an ostrich while his kingdom was slipping through his fingers. On September 17, 1970, the king unleashed his army against the terrorist bases and camps. It was a terrible massacre. Terrorists were shot in the streets, hunted, captured, and executed without trial. Some of them found shelter in the Palestinian refugee camps, but the Jordanian artillery shelled the camps without a shadow of remorse, killing thousands. Scores of panicked terrorists crossed the Jordan River and surrendered to the Israeli army. They preferred to rot in Israeli prisons than die by Jordanian guns. During the massacre, most of the surviving terrorists escaped to Syria and Lebanon. Until this very day, the number of dead terrorists in Black September remains unknown. The figures are between 2,000 and 7,000 people. Yasser Arafat, chief of Fatah, the major Palestinian terrorist organization, became obsessed with revenge. He created, inside the Fatah, a secret inner organization, an underground within an underground. The regular Fatah members and commanders didn't even know of its existence. He called it Black September. This organization did not comply with the respectable lines of conduct that Arafat now tried to impose on his group in order to achieve international recognition and sympathy. It was to be a cruel, unrestrained group that would attack the enemies of the Palestinian people in every possible way, without mercy. Formally, Black September did not exist, and Arafat would deny any connection to it, but secretly he was its creator and leader. He appointed Abu Yusuf, one of the senior Fatah commanders, as the head of Black September. As chief of operations, he selected Ali Hassan Salameh, a young man with fanatic views but no less brave or smart. Ali was the son of Hassan Salameh, who had been the last supreme commander of the Palestinian forces during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Hassan Salameh had been killed in battle, and his son Ali had vowed to continue his father's struggle. Black September's first operations didn't worry Israel too much, as they were mostly directed against Jordan. The terrorists bombed the Rome offices of the Jordanian National Airline, attacked the Jordanian embassy in Paris with Molotov cocktails, hijacked a Jordanian airliner to Libya, sabotaged the Jordanian embassy in Bern, an electronics plant in Germany, and oil reservoirs in Hamburg and Rotterdam. In the cellar of a house in Bonn, they murdered 5 Jordanian secret agents. In their most appalling operation, they murdered former Jordanian Prime Minister Wasfi al-Tal in the lobby of the Cairo Sheraton. One of the assassins crouched over the body and lapped his victim's blood. With Israel's victory in the 1967 Six-Day War, the terrorists now took upon themselves to continue the war against the Jewish state. They hijacked aircraft, crossed Israel's borders, and assassinated civilians, planted bombs and explosive charges in the big cities. The Shabak and the Mossad had to fight a new enemy now, penetrate the terrorist organizations, foil their plans, and arrest their activists. Fatah was the major organization Israel had to confront now. Black September was not. But Black September soon crossed the limits it had originally set to its activities and started acting against Western nations, first and foremost, against Israel. The Munich massacre was their first, bloody assault. And that was how Ali Hassan Salameh earned his nickname. He was the brains behind the Munich operation. The rumors about his obsession with killing and blood spread among the terrorists, and they started calling Hassan Salameh's son the Red Prince. In early October 1972, 2 retired generals asked to meet with Prime Minister Golda Meir, who had replaced Levi Eshkol after his sudden death in 1969. They were the new Ramsad, Zvi Zamir, and the Prime Minister's advisor on counterterrorism, former Amman chief Aaron Yariv. Golda Meir had been utterly traumatized by Munich Night, when the Israeli athletes had been murdered. Once again, bound and tied Jews are being murdered on German soil, she had said. Golda was a strong, tough woman. It was clear that she wouldn't let the Munich massacre go without punishment. That was exactly what Zamir and Yariv came to propose. Zvi Zamir, skinny, balding, and freckled, with sharp features jutting out of a triangular face, was a former Palmach fighter but was not regarded as an outstanding general. The highest position he had reached during his military service was commander of the Southern Front. He later served as military attaché and representative of the Israeli Ministry of Defense in Great Britain. In 1968, he was appointed Ramsad to replace Meir Amit, who had completed his term. Many criticized Zamir's appointment. He was a bland and shy man with no experience in secret operations, lacking charisma. He didn't consider himself the Mossad chief like Harel and Amit before him. He preferred to act as a sort of chairman of the board, and delegated authority to many of his senior aides. He would achieve his fame only in the Yom Kippur War, see Chapter 14, but in 1972 he couldn't claim any substantial success. And some of the veteran agents of the Mossad, like Rafi Eitan, disliked him and left the service in protest. Yariv, like Zamir, was more a man in the background than a man of limelight. He had been an outstanding Amman chief during the Six-Day War, but he was admired mostly because of his learned, analytical mind. Slim, soft-spoken, bespectacled, with a clear forehead, the well-mannered Yariv looked more like an erudite professor than a master spy. Yariv and Zamir had a lot in common. They were supposed to be rivals, because of their overlapping functions, yet they worked in harmony and mutual trust. They both were quiet, low-key, reserved, and rather shy. They hated to take center stage and were very cautious in their analyses and planning. But the idea they presented to Golda that October afternoon was surprisingly brutal. The secret services would identify and locate the Black September leaders, and kill them. All of them. Since Munich, Yaniv and Zamir had engaged in feverish activity and had gathered top-notch intelligence about Black September. They came to Golda prepared. Black September, they said, intended to launch an all-out war against Israel. This was a group that had sworn to kill as many Jews as possible, military, civilians, women and children. The only way to stop it was to kill all its leaders, one after the other. Crush the snake's head. Golda hesitated. It was not easy for her to make a decision that would mean sending young people to a risky assassination campaign. Israel had never done that before. She sat quiet for a long time. Then she started speaking, in a barely audible voice, as if she were talking to herself. She mentioned the horrid memory of the Holocaust and the tragic march of the Jewish people through the ages, always persecuted, hunted, and massacred. Finally, she raised her head and looked at Yariv and Zamir. "Send the boys," she said. Zamir immediately started preparing the operation. He called it Wrath of God. But Golda, too, had her say. As a prime minister of a democratic Jewish state, Golda could not rely only on the promise of Yariv and Zamir that the boys would hurt no one but the leaders and the major militants of Black September. Promises were not enough. She knew well that such an operation would be outside the law, and that if the civilian supervision of Mossad's actions was loosened, there was a real danger that innocent people might also be killed. Therefore, she decided to establish a tight control over Wrath of God. She created a secret committee that included, besides her, Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan and Deputy Prime Minister Yigal Allon, a brilliant former general. The three of them became a secret tribunal that had to review and approve every individual case in the operation. They were called the X Committee. Yariv and Zamir had to submit every file and name to the trio, and only after getting their approval could the Mossad hit team enter the scene. Mossad, Caesarea, the operational department of the Mossad, was assigned to carry out Wrath of God. It was headed by Mike Harari, a black-haired, rugged, and secretive agent. Almost all the hits were to be carried out in Europe, where Black September had deployed its men and where they were protected by sophisticated covers. Harari picked his men from Kaidan, the Mossad operational team. Each unit sent against a Black September operative was composed of several secondary crews. A crew of 6 men and women would be charged with identifying and following the suspects. They had to make sure that the man they targeted was indeed the right one, the wolf in sheep's clothing. They would arrive in the city where the suspect terrorist operated, follow him, secretly photograph him, learn his habits, locate his friends, find his exact address, the bars and restaurants he visited, his routine, hour by hour. A smaller unit, in most cases just a man and a woman, was in charge of the logistics, renting apartments, hotel rooms, and cars. Another small crew was in charge of communications with the advanced operational headquarters established in the respective European cities and with the Mossad headquarters in Israel. The hit team itself consisted of several Mossad agents, who were the last to arrive on the ground. Their task was to get to a certain address, at a certain time, and kill the man whose photograph and other identifying details had been given to them. While they operated in the targeted city, they were protected by another team, a crew of armed agents and drivers, who were positioned nearby, with vehicles ready to move and escape routes designed and rehearsed. Their task was to protect, with weapons, if necessary, the members of the hit team. Immediately after the operation was over, all hit team members and their security details would leave the country. The crew that identified and followed the suspect would have left the country before the operation. The others would stay a few more days to cover up the traces, pack equipment, and return rental cars used for the operation. The first city chosen for a Wrath of God operation was Rome. In the Eternal City, the advance team identified and followed a man who could never be suspected of terrorism, a low-level clerk in the Libyan embassy, a Nablus-born, 38-year-old Palestinian, Wael's waiter. He was slim, gentle, and soft-spoken, the son of a well-known man of letters and translator into Arabic. Wael himself was known for his excellent translation of fiction and poetry into and from Arabic. He also was a devoted art lover. He worked as an interpreter at the Libyan embassy for the meager salary of 100 Libyan dinars a month, led a very modest life, and lived in a tiny apartment on Piazza Annibaliano. His friends knew him as a moderate man who rejected any form of violence and often expressed his disgust toward terrorism and killing. But even Zweiter's closest friends were not aware of his secret. Their good friend was a cruel fanatic, who commanded the Black September operations in Rome with ruthless determination. Recently, he had devised and carried out a lethal operation. He identified 2 young English women who spent the first days of their vacation in Rome before continuing to Israel. Zweiter instructed 2 young, handsome, and charming Palestinians to establish contact with the girls and try to seduce them. And indeed, soon the young Casanovas landed in the Englishwomen's beds. When parting from their lovers, one of the Palestinians asked his girl to take a small record player with her, a gift for his family on the West Bank. The silly girl readily agreed, and the record player was duly checked with the lady's other luggage at the El Al counter in Rome's airport. They did not know that Zweiter and their charming lovers were sending them to their death. Under Zweiter's supervision, the Black September agents had taken the record player apart, stuffed it with explosives, then repacked it in a brand new box. The booby-trap device was programmed to explode as soon as the aircraft reached its cruising altitude. The plane and all its passengers were doomed. Fortunately, the terrorists did not know that after a Swissair liner headed for Israel had been blown up by a similar device, the storage compartments of LAL's planes had been covered with thick armor plate, so that no explosion could wreck the aircraft. The record player did explode, but the blast was contained by the armor. The LL pilot, alerted by a flashing red light, immediately returned to the airport. The stunned English girls were interrogated and revealed their involvement with their Palestinian lovers, but those 2 had left Italy right after they bid a heartbreaking farewell to the girls they were sending to their deaths. The first cruise of the hit team arrived in Rome and followed Zweiter for several days. A young couple strolled in front of the Libyan embassy and the woman clicked a camera concealed in her handbag every time Zweiter went in or out of the embassy. Some tourists arrived in Rome by various flights. One of them, a 47-year-old Canadian by the name of Anthony Hutton, rented an Avis car and told the clerk he was staying at the Excelsior Hotel on Via Veneto. If the clerk had checked the information, he would have found that no such person was staying at the Excelsior, exactly like some other tourists who had rented cars that same week and given false addresses to the car rental agencies. On the night of October 16th, Zweiter returned home and was about to put a 10 lira coin in the elevator slot. The house entrance was dark and somebody on the 3rd floor was playing a melancholy tune on the piano. Suddenly 2 men emerged from the shadows and pumped 12 0.22 Beretta bullets in Zweiter's body. Nobody heard the shots. The 2 agents jumped into a Fiat 125 parked on the Plaza Annibaliano. A few hours later, they were out of the country. Now that Zweiter had been killed, his deep cover was no longer necessary. A Beirut paper published his obituary, signed by several terrorist organizations that mourned Zweiter as one of our best combatants. The leader of the small team that killed Zweiter was an Israeli in his mid-20s, David Mossad, not his real name. He was born in Tunisia and emigrated to Israel as a child. From his parents, both teachers and Zionists, he had inherited a perfect mastery of the French language, a profound, deeply emotional love for the State of Israel, and a burning patriotism. Since a young age, he had dreamed of serving Israel, even at the risk of his life. In the army, he had volunteered for an elite commando unit in the IDF and amazed his commanders with his daring and creativity. After his discharge, he had joined the Mossad and had quickly become one of its best agents, participating in the most hazardous operations. Because of his fluent French, he could easily assume the identity of a Frenchman, Belgian, Canadian, or Swiss. He married young, and soon became the father of a little boy, but this did not cool his urge to serve on the front lines of the Mossad fighters. After Zweiter's death, Mossad spent a few days in Israel, then flew to Paris. A few days later, the phone rang in an apartment on 175 Rue Elysia, in Paris. Dr. Mahmoud Hamshari answered the call. Is this Dr. Hamshari? The PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, representative in France? The caller had a strong Italian accent. He introduced himself as an Italian journalist who sympathized with the Palestinian cause and asked to interview Hamshari. They agreed to meet in a cafe, far from Hamshari's home. Hamshari, a respected historian who lived in Paris with his French wife, Marie-Claude, and their little daughter, had been taking very strict precautions lately. When walking the streets, he kept watching for people who might be shadowing him. He left cafes and restaurants before his order was filled. He often checked with his neighbors if any strangers had asked about him. On the face of it, he had nothing to worry about. He was an academic, a moderate man, well integrated in the Parisian intellectual circles. He does not need any precautions, wrote Annie Francos in the Jeune Afrique Weekly, because he is not dangerous. The Israeli secret services know that well. But the Israeli secret services knew a few more things: Hamshari's participation in the foiled attempt to assassinate Ben-Gurion in Denmark in 1969, his involvement in the Midair explosion of a Swissair liner in 1970 that took the lives of 47 people, his connections with mysterious young Arabs, who would sneak into his apartment at night, carrying heavy suitcases. The Israeli Secret Services also knew that Hamshari was now the second in command of Black September in Europe. So, on the day Hamshari left for his interview with the Italian reporter, a couple of men broke into his apartment and left 15 minutes later. The following day, the strangers waited until Hamshari's wife and daughter left the apartment and he remained there by himself. The telephone rang and he picked up the receiver. Dr. Hamshari? The Italian journalist again. Yes, speaking. At that moment, Hamshari heard a shrill whistle, and, after it, a thunderous explosion. An explosive charge that had been concealed under his desk blew up and Hamshari collapsed, gravely wounded. A few days later he died in the hospital, not before blaming the Mossad for his death. A few weeks after Hamshari's death, Mike Harari and a man named Jonathan Ingleby arrived on the island of Cyprus. They checked into the Olympia Hotel in Nicosia. Lately, because of its location, close to Israel, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt, Cyprus had become a battlefield between Israeli and Arab agents. This time, the two Israeli agents shadowed a Palestinian by the name of Hussein Abd el-Hir. A few months before, Abd el-Hir had been appointed the Black September resident in Cyprus. He was also in charge of relations with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc nations that had become a paradise and a safe haven for the terrorists. In Russia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Palestinian terrorists trained in army installations and special forces units. Those countries sent shipments of weapons and equipment for the terrorist organizations. Quite a few Palestinian leaders, enthusiastic believers in the Soviet ideology, studied at the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. Abd el-Hir also was in charge of infiltrating terrorists into Israel, and eliminating Arab spies who came to Cyprus to meet their Israeli handlers. The ex-committee sentenced him to death. That night, Abd el-Hir returned to his hotel room, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Jonathan Ingleby made sure that the man was asleep, then pressed a button on a remote control monitor. A shattering explosion shook the hotel. In a third-floor hotel room, a couple of Israeli honeymooners dived under their bed for protection. The reception clerk rushed to Abd el-Hir's room. When the smoke cleared, he saw a terrifying scene that made him faint. Abd el-Hir's bloodied head was facing him, stuck in the lavatory pan. Black September's revenge was instantaneous. On January 26, 1973, an Israeli by the name of Moshe Hanan Ishai met with a Palestinian friend at the Morrison pub on José Antonio Street in Madrid. After they left the pub, two men appeared in front of them and blocked their way. The Palestinian escaped, while the two men drew their weapons, sprayed Ishai with bullets, and vanished. Only a few days later, it was established that Ishai's real name was Baruch Cohen, a veteran Mossad agent who had established a network of Palestinian students in Madrid. The young man he had met at the pub was one of his informants, who actually had been planted in the network by Black September. His comrades avenged Abd el-Hir's death by taking out Baruch Cohen. Black September was also suspected of shooting and wounding another Israeli agent, Zadok Ofer, in a Brussels cafe, and of assassinating Dr. Ami Shekeri, an attaché at the Israeli embassy in London, by a letter bomb. 2 weeks after Abd el-Hir's death, Black September appointed a new agent in Cyprus. Barely 24 hours after arriving in Nicosia, the Palestinian met with his KGB contact, returned to his hotel, turned off the light, and died in the same way as his predecessor. Arafat and Ali Hassan Salameh decided, therefore, to carry out a massive act of revenge. They planned to hijack a plane, load it with explosives, and have it flown to Israel by a suicide commando. The aircraft would then be crashed in the midst of Tel Aviv, killing hundreds. It was an early version of the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers in New York. The Mossad informants got wind of the preparations, and several agents started following a group of Palestinians in Paris, who were apparently in charge of the project. One night, the agents noticed an older man who had joined the group. They dispatched the man's photos to Mossad headquarters, and the stranger was identified as Basil al-Qubaisi, a senior leader of Black September. Qubaisi was a well-known jurist, a law professor at the American University in Beirut, and a respected scholar. But he, too, like Swader and Hamshari and quite a few others, secretly was a dangerous man. In 1956, he had tried to assassinate Iraq's King Faisal by placing a car bomb on the path of the royal convoy. The bomb exploded prematurely, and al-Qubaisi escaped to Lebanon, and then to the United States. A few years later, he tried to assassinate Golda Meir, who was visiting the United States. When this attempt failed, he tried to murder Meir at the Socialist International Summit in Paris. It was another failure. Al-Qubaisi didn't give up. He joined the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and became the deputy of George Habash, the group's leader. He participated in the planning of the May 30, 1972, massacre, in which innocent passengers in the Lod airport were attacked by Arab and Japanese terrorists. 26 people died in the attack, most of them Puerto Rican pilgrims to the Holy Land. Later, al-Qubaisi joined Black September, and now he was in Paris, probably to direct the suicide plane operation. He checked into a small hotel on Rue des Arcades, off the Place de la Madeleine. On April 6, after having dinner at Café de la Paix, al-Qubaisi was on his way back to his hotel. At the Place de la Madeleine, the Mossad's hit team was waiting. 2 people had been placed on the street, 2 more in a car. One of them was wearing a blonde wig. As al-Qubaisi came closer, the 2 agents approached him, cocking their guns. But something unexpected happened. A flashy car stopped next to al-Qubaisi, and a pretty young woman leaned out of the window. They exchanged a few phrases, and al-Qubaisi got into the car, which left immediately. The frustrated agents realized that the woman was a prostitute, and had just propositioned al-Qubaisi. The entire operation was going to fail because of a hooker. But the team commander, who was present, calmed his disappointed warriors. "Wait and see," he said knowingly, "she'll bring him back here shortly." They didn't ask how he knew, but the man was right. Barely 20 minutes later, the car was back. Al-Qubaisi parted from the prostitute and started walking toward his hotel. He had only taken a few steps when 2 men emerged from the shadows, blocking his way. One of them was David Mossad. Al-Qubaisi immediately understood. "No!" he shouted in French. "No! Don't do that!" 9 bullets pierced his body and he collapsed by the Madeleine Church. The Mossad agents jumped in the getaway car and left the square. The following day, as in the Swader case, the spokesman of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine revealed the real role of the law professor. In the following months, Mossad and the members of Kaidan killed several Black September envoys who had come to Greece to buy ships, load them with explosives, and sail them to Israel's ports. But one question remained unanswered: where was the mastermind behind Munich? Where was Salome? Salome was in his Beirut headquarters, planning his next moves. The first was the takeover of the Israeli embassy in Thailand by a Black September team. But the operation had failed. Threatened by the tough Thai generals and pressured by the Egyptian ambassador in Bangkok, the terrorists released their hostages and left Thailand utterly humiliated. Salome's next operation was more reckless. His men, armed to the teeth, broke into the Saudi embassy in Khartoum during a farewell party for a European envoy, and captured almost the entire diplomatic corps in the Sudanese capital. By Arafat's order, they released most of the hostages, and kept only the U.S. ambassador, Cleo A. Noel, the deputy chief of the U.S. mission, George C. Moore, and the Belgian acting ambassador, Guy Eade. Following Salome's instructions, they murdered them with horrific cruelty, firing first at the feet and legs of their victims, then slowly raising the barrels of their Kalashnikov assault rifles till they ripped open their chests. The terrorists were arrested after the massacre but released a few weeks later by the Sudanese government. The world reacted with fury and disgust to the appalling assassination of the diplomats. Israel felt that it was time to deal Black September a mortal blow. In Jerusalem, Golda Meir gave the go-ahead to Operation Spring of Youth, a new phase in the ongoing Operation Wrath of God. On April 1, 1973, a 35-year-old Belgian tourist named Gilbert Rambo checked into the Sands Hotel in Beirut. The same day another tourist, Dieter Altnutter, also checked into the hotel. The two men apparently didn't know each other. Both were given rooms with ocean view. On April 6, 3 more tourists arrived in the hotel. The dapper, impeccably dressed Andrew Wichelaw was British. David Mossad, who arrived 2 hours later on the Rome flight, produced a Belgian passport in the name of Charles Boussard. George Elder, who arrived in the evening, was British, too, but quite the opposite of his fellow countrymen. Another British tourist, Charles Macy, checked into the Atlantic Hotel on El Baida Beach. And, like a real Englishman, he inquired twice a day about the weather forecast. Each on his own, the 6 men toured Beirut, walked the streets, and got familiar with the main traffic arteries. At the Avis and Linacar agencies, they rented 3 Buick Skylarks, a Plymouth station wagon, a Valiant, and a Renault 16. On April 9, a flotilla of 9 missile boats and patrol vessels of the Israeli Navy took to the high seas and blended into the international traffic lanes. The MB Mivta carried a paratrooper unit under the command of Colonel Amnon Lipkin, which was to attack the headquarters of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. 2 other units had embarked on the MB Gash, another paratrooper platoon, and the Sayeret Matkal unit, under Colonel Ehud Barak. They had a different mission. Before embarking, each of them had received the photos of 4 people. 3 of them were Abu Yusuf, the supreme commander of Black September, Kamal Adwan, the Fatah top operations commander, who was also in charge of Black September's operations in the Israeli-occupied territories, and Kamal Nasser, Fatah's main spokesman. All 3, the soldiers were told, lived in the same apartment building on Rue Verdun. The 4th photo was of Ali Hassan Salame. Nobody knew where he was. The commandos were wearing civilian clothes. At 9:30 p.m., as the boats approached Beirut, they donned wigs and hippie clothes. Ehud Barak put on women's clothes, assuming the appearance of a voluptuous brunette. In his brassiere, he concealed several explosive charges. Out of the dark, several rubber dinghies emerged on the deserted Beirut beach, bringing over the paratroopers from the motherships. In front of them, they saw the 6 cars, with one of the tourists behind each wheel. Each soldier knew to which car he was assigned. In a matter of minutes, the cars darted in different directions. A few of them turned to the headquarters of the Popular Front. Other vehicles, one of them driven by Mossad, headed for the apartment building where the leaders of Black September lived. The military commando unit that headed for the Popular Front headquarters had rehearsed the attack before, using an unfinished building in a Tel Aviv suburb. One night, when Chief of Staff David Dado Elazar had come to watch the training, he had been approached by a young, handsome lieutenant, Avita Shore. "We are going to use 120 kilograms of explosives to bring down the building in Beirut," Avita said. "But this is unnecessary and dangerous. The explosion would affect the neighboring buildings, and there are lots of civilians there." He took a notebook from his pocket. "I made some calculations. We should use only 80 kilograms of explosives. That will bring the building down without harming innocent people in other houses." Elazar had the figures checked, and agreed to Shore's suggestion. He instructed the operation commander to use a charge of no more than 80 kilograms. Now, the paratroopers reached the Popular Front headquarters. After a short shootout, in which 2 Israeli commandos lost their lives, the paratroopers took over the entrance lobby of the building and planted the 80 kilograms of explosives. The explosion turned the building into a heap of ruins, killing scores of terrorists, but not one of the neighboring houses was damaged. One of the commandos killed was Lieutenant Avita Shore. At the same time, other units of paratroopers and naval commandos attacked several terrorist camps south of Beirut, in a diversionary move intended to draw the response of the terrorists and the Lebanese army. But there was no such response. At that very moment, the Sayeret Matkal commandos reached the building on Rue Verdun. They were about to enter, when 2 Lebanese police officers passed by. But all they saw was a pair of lovers tenderly embracing on the sidewalk. The Romeo was none other than Mookie Betzer, one of the best Sayeret fighters, and his curvaceous Juliet was Ehud Barak. As soon as the policemen had turned the corner, the Israelis stormed the building. They simultaneously broke into the apartments of Kamal Adwan, on the 2nd floor, Kamal Nasser, on the 3rd floor, and Abu Yusuf, on the 6th. The terrorist leaders had no chance whatsoever. When the paratroopers broke into their flats, they reached for their weapons, but the soldiers were faster. In minutes, the 3 terrorists were killed. Abu Yusuf's wife tried to shield him with her body and was hit as well. Another casualty was an old Italian woman who lived across the landing from Adwan's apartment. She heard the shots, opened the door, and was slain with a burst of gunfire. During the operation, the commandos collected documents that they found in the cupboards and drawers of the Black September leaders. Then they collected their wounded and dead and rushed to the cars headed for the beach, where the rubber dinghies were waiting. On the beach, the 6 Mossad tourists parked their rented cars in a neat row, leaving the keys in the ignitions. A few days later, the rental companies received the payment via American Express. The task force was reunited on the mothership and sailed to Israel. The operation was a total success. The PFLP headquarters was no more, the Black September leaders had been killed, among them Abu Yusuf, the organization commander. But the commandos didn't know that barely 50 yards away from the house on Rue Verdun, Ali Hassan Salameh was sleeping peacefully in an inconspicuous apartment. He had not been disturbed. The next day, when Abu Yusuf's death was announced, he became Black September's leader. Spring of Youth heralded the end of Black September. The organization would never recover, after all its leaders had been killed. All but one. In Tel Aviv, the document seized during Spring of Youth helped solve a mystery that had preoccupied the Mossad for the previous 2 years. That was the Passover affair. In April 1971, 2 young, pretty French women landed at Lod Airport and tried to go through immigration with fake French passports. The airport security had received an early warning about their arrival. The girls were taken to a side room where they were searched by policewomen and Shabak female officers. The search revealed something strange. The women's clothing, including their underwear, weighed twice what would feel like its normal weight. The policewomen found that the French women's clothes were saturated by some white powder. Apparently, the clothes had been immersed in a thick solution that contained the white powder. When the garments were shaken and rubbed, large quantities of the powder dropped off. More white powder was found in the heels of the ladies' exquisite sandals. The two girls were carrying about 12 pounds of white powder that turned out to be a powerful plastic explosive. In a box of tampons, in one of the girls' suitcase, the police found scores of detonators. The girls broke down under interrogation and admitted that they were sisters, daughters of a rich Moroccan businessman. Their names were Nadia and Madeleine Bardelli. They had been contacted by a man in Paris, and being adventurous by nature, had agreed to smuggle the powder. "And who else is in this with you?" the police detectives asked. That afternoon, several police officers raided the small Hotel Commodore in Tel Aviv and arrested an old French couple, Pierre and Edith Burgalter. When they disassembled the transistor radio of the couple, they found it had been stuffed with delayed action fuses for the manufacture of explosive charges. Pierre Burgalter burst into tears. The next day, the unsuspecting commander of the operation landed in Israel as well, an attractive 26-year-old Frenchwoman, carrying a passport in the name of Francine Adelaine Maria. Her true name was Evelyn Barges, and she was well known to the Mossad as a professional terrorist, a fanatic Marxist who already had participated in several terrorist attacks in Europe. When interrogated by police, the members of the so-called Passover team confessed that they had intended to blow up their plastic charges in 9 major Tel Aviv hotels at the peak of the tourist season, and kill as many tourists and Israelis as possible, dealing Israel a heavy blow. This nice bunch went to jail, but the man who pulled the strings behind the scenes had not been caught. He was Mohamed Boudia, a charming Algerian, a director of a Paris theater and an actor himself. Again, a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a man of culture, an intellectual and an artist, whose life on stage was but a cover for his criminal activities. He was Evelyn Barges' lover, and involved in so many love affairs that the Mossad agents called him Bluebeard. Boudia was originally under the orders of George Habash and the PFLP. A year after the Passover team had been captured, he had joined Black September and was appointed head of the organization in France. He was involved in the murder of Kader Kanu, a Syrian reporter in Paris who was suspected of being a Mossad informant. Boudia was also in charge of Black September's operations in Europe, and planned an attack on a transit camp for Jewish immigrants from Russia. After Hamshari's assassination, Boudia became extremely cautious, and following him became incredibly difficult. In May 1973, a hit team of the Mossad group arrived in Paris and tried to find Boudia. They had the name and address of Boudia's new lover. The agents waited patiently around the corner of the building where she lived. Finally, Boudia emerged out of nowhere and snuck inside. But the next day, when most of the residents left the building for work, he was not among them. Only after a frustrating month, when the agents had compared notes, did they notice something strange. Every morning, after the torrid nights Boudia spent with his lover, a tall, big woman would be among the people coming out of the house. At times, she would be a blonde, at other times, brunette. At last the agent solved the riddle. Using his actor's talents, Boudia disguised himself as a woman before leaving the building. But now, for some reason, he stopped visiting his mistress, and the Mossad lost track of him. The only lead they still had was that every morning he traveled by subway to his meetings, and took a connecting train at the Etoile station, under the Arc de Triomphe. That metro station was a major hub, scores of trains passed through it, millions of people ran through the underground passages, switching lines. How could they find Boudia, the man with 1,000 faces? But there was no other choice. Mossad agents were alerted from all over Europe. Scores of Israelis received Boudia's photos and were positioned in the corridors, passages, hallways, and platforms of the giant Etoile station. One day passed, then 2 and 3, and nothing happened. But on the 4th day, one of the agents spotted Boudia, disguised, made up, but still the man they were looking for. This time they stuck to him like shadows till he got into his car that was parked near the metro exit. They followed the car and watched it through the night, while Boudia stayed in a house on the Rue de Fosse Saint-Bernard, probably his new lover's abode. The next morning, June 29, 1973, Budya approached his car, inspected it thoroughly from the outside, peeked under the chassis, and, apparently satisfied, unlocked it and took the driver's seat. A deafening explosion turned the car into a heap of twisted, blackened metal and killed Budya. According to European reporters, the Mossad, Zvizimir, watched the explosion from a street corner. But the heads of Mossad had no time to celebrate their success. An urgent message reached headquarters. A special Black September messenger, the Algerian Ben Amana, had been sent to meet with Ali Hassan Salameh. Ben Amana had crossed Europe in an odd, tortuous route, and had reached Lillehammer, a resort town in Norway. A few days later, the Kaidan hit team, under Mike Harari's command, was positioned in Lillehammer. Nobody had any idea what Salameh was doing in the quiet mountain town. The first crew followed Ben Amana to the town's swimming pool and saw him establishing contact with a Middle Eastern-looking man. 3 members of the crew looked at the photographs they carried and concluded that the man undoubtedly was Salameh. They overruled their 4th colleague, who had overheard the man speaking with other people, and pointed out that it was impossible that Salameh could speak Norwegian. The agents were cocksure in the identification. They followed Salameh in Lillehammer's streets and saw him in the company of a young, pregnant Norwegian woman. The operation entered its final stage. More agents arrived from Israel. Zvizimir was among them. Salameh's elimination was to be the last step in the total destruction of Black September, and Zvizimir wanted to be there for the finale. The killers were to be the ubiquitous Jonathan Ingleby, along with Rolf Baer and Gerard-Emile Lafond. David Mossad did not participate in that operation. The support crew rented cars and hotel rooms. Some maintain that the town residents immediately noticed the unusual activity, the presence in Lillehammer of many tourists, whose cars whooshed in all directions, was not a common sight in Lillehammer during the summer. On July 21, 1973, Salameh and his pregnant friend came out of a cinema where they had seen Clint Eastwood in Where Eagles Dare. The couple took the bus and got off on a quiet, deserted street. Suddenly a white car braked beside them, a couple of men jumped out on the sidewalk, Beretta guns in their hands, and sprayed Salameh's body with 14 bullets. The Red Prince was dead. The operation over, Mike Harari ordered his men to leave Norway right away. The pullout was done according to the rules. The killers left first, abandoning their white car in Lillehammer center, and took the first flights out of Oslo, the capital. Most of the agents and Mike Harari were the next to depart, leaving behind the crew that was to evacuate the safe houses and return the rental cars. But an unexpected coincidence turned everything upside down. A woman who lived near where the shooting took place noticed the color, white, and the make, Peugeot, of the killer's car. A police officer, manning a roadblock between Lillehammer and Oslo, saw a white Peugeot driven by a striking-looking woman and noted the car's license plate. The following day, when the car was returned at the airport car rental desk, the police arrested its occupants, Dan Erbel and Marianne Gladnikoff. Their interrogation brought about the arrest of 2 more agents, Sylvia Raphael and Avraham Gemmer. Another 2 agents were arrested the same day. Erbel and Gladnikoff broke down under the intensive interrogation. They revealed top-secret information about the operation, addresses of safe houses in Norway and throughout Europe, conspiracy rules, phone numbers, and modus operandi of the Mossad. The police raided an apartment in Oslo and found a trove of documents there. They also discovered that Igal Eyal, the Israeli embassy security officer, had a connection with the Mossad. It was a disaster. The next day, Norway's media published the news about the Israeli agents' arrests. It was a terrible blow to the Mossad's prestige and credibility. But the media published another piece of news, even more devastating. The Mossad had killed the wrong man. The man killed in Lillehammer was not Ali Hassan Salameh. He was Ahmed Bouchiki, a Moroccan waiter who had come to Norway looking for a job. He had also married a Norwegian woman, the blonde Toril, who was 7 months pregnant. Sensational headlines sprouted all over the world's newspapers. The captured agents stood trial and some of them were sentenced to long prison terms. One of them, Sylvia Raphael, made a strong impression on the Norwegians by her proud and noble appearance. Her trial brought her an unexpected prize. She fell in love with her Norwegian attorney, and after her release from jail she married him and lived happily with him till she died of cancer in 2005. After the Lillehammer fiasco, the heads of the Mossad had to clean house, change conspiracy rules, abandon safe houses, establish new contacts. They had to admit their responsibility for Ahmed Boushiki's death and pay $400,000 to his family. But the worst was that the legend of the glorious, invincible Mossad had been shattered. Golda Meir ordered Zvi Zamir to end Wrath of God immediately. But soon the failure was obscured by more dramatic events. On October 6, the armies of Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. The Yom Kippur War had begun. See Chapter 14. 2 years passed. On a balmy spring evening in 1975, a Beirut family hosted the most beautiful woman in the world. Georgina Rizek certainly deserved that title, as 4 years before she had been elected Miss Universe in the flashy beauty contest at Miami Beach, Florida. The gorgeous Lebanese beauty had won fame, awards, trips, meetings with world leaders. Back in Lebanon, she had developed a brilliant career as a supermodel and owner of fashion boutiques. That evening, in her friend's home, she met a handsome, charismatic young man. They fell in love. 2 years later, on June 8, 1977, they got married. The happy groom was Ali Hassan Salameh. His career, too, had soared in the previous few years. At the end of 1973, Black September ceased to exist. Despite the collapse of his organization, Salameh had become Arafat's right hand and his adopted son. Rumor had it that he would be appointed Arafat's successor at the helm of the PLO. After the fall of Black September, Salameh was made head of Force 17, which was in charge of personal security of the Fatah leaders and of all unorthodox coups de main. Salameh accompanied Arafat on a trip to New York. Arafat entered the United Nations General Assembly holding an olive branch in his hand but carrying his gun on his belt. Salameh was at Arafat's side when the latter traveled to Moscow and met with powerful world leaders. To Israel's amazement, he was also courted by the CIA. In another of its great oversights, the Central Intelligence Agency decided to ignore the bloody past of the Red Prince, his role in the Munich massacre, the savage assassination of American diplomats in Khartoum that he masterminded, the simple fact that Salameh was one of the most dangerous terrorists in the world, and recruited Salameh as its informant. The CIA hoped that Salameh would become a loyal servant of American interests. The CIA offered Salameh hundreds of thousands of dollars, but he refused. On the other hand, he agreed to spend a long vacation with Georgina in Hawaii, all expenses covered by the agency. Salameh's lifestyle had changed, and his friends had started to believe that his life was no longer in danger. But he felt that his days were numbered. He did not stop speaking about his death. "I know," he said to a reporter, "that when my fate is sealed the end will come. Nobody will be able to save me." Israel decided to seal his fate. Many changes had taken place in Israel since the downfall of Black September. Golda Meir had gone, her successor, Yitzhak Rabin, had resigned, and a new prime minister, Menachem Begin, was now in power. Zvi Zamir had been replaced as Ramsad by General Yitzhak Haka Hafi, a former commander of the northern region. The Palestinian terror against Israel continued, in sporadic outbursts. In 1976, the hijacking of an Air France plane to Entebbe, in Uganda, had resulted in a daring rescue raid by Israeli paratroopers and Sayeret Matkal. In 1978, Fatah terrorists landed in Israel, hijacked a civilian bus, and proceeded to Tel Aviv. They were stopped by a roadblock in the city outskirts, and were finally overpowered, but not before murdering 35 civilian passengers. Civilian men, women, and children were regularly brutally murdered in terrorist incursions into Israeli territory. Menachem Begin felt that no terrorist with blood on his hands could be left in peace. In the late 70s, Salameh's name was on the Avengers list once again. An undercover Mossad agent was sent to Beirut and managed to join the health club where Salameh exercised. One day, as he walked into the sauna, he found himself face to face with the naked Salameh. This stunning discovery triggered a fiery debate at Mossad headquarters. A naked Salameh in his health club was an easy prey. On the other hand, any attempt to kill him there could result in the death of civilians, therefore, the plan was abandoned. Enter Erica Mary Chambers. She was a single Englishwoman, eccentric and strange, who had lived in Germany for the last 4 years. She arrived in Beirut and rented an apartment on the 8th floor of a building at the corner of Rue Verdun and Rue Madame Curie. Her neighbors nicknamed her Penelope. She told them she did volunteer work for an international organization taking care of poor children. She was seen, indeed, in hospitals and relief agencies. Some even said she had met with Ali Hassan Salameh. She seemed to be a very lonely woman. Always disheveled, shabbily dressed, Penelope would emerge on the street with plates full of food for stray cats. Her apartment was also said to be full of her beloved felines. She was also a passionate painter, but those who saw her canvases quickly realized that her talents were rather limited. But besides painting Lebanon's landscapes, what really interested Miss Chambers was the busy traffic in the street below and, more specifically, the daily passage of 2 cars under her windows, a tan Chevrolet station wagon, always followed by a Land Rover Jeep. Using a code, Erica scrupulously noted the times and directions of the vehicle's movements. Every morning they came from the Snubra neighborhood, down Verdun and Curie streets, heading south toward the Fatah headquarters. They came back at lunchtime, and reappeared in the early afternoon, heading to headquarters again. Watching the cars with a pair of binoculars, Erica identified Salameh sitting in the back seat of the Chevrolet between 2 armed bodyguards. Several other armed terrorists rode in the Land Rover that followed. Salameh's guards perhaps could protect him, but they could not save him from the worst enemy of a secret agent, routine. Since his marriage to beautiful Georgina, Salameh's life had fallen into a steady pattern. He had settled with his wife in the Snubra neighborhood, and would go to work, like a clerk, every morning at the same time, come home for lunch and rest, return to work after the siesta. He was ignoring the basic rules of secret activity: never develop regular habits, never stay at the same address for too long, never use the same itinerary twice, never travel at the same time of day. On January 18, 1979, a British tourist, Peter Scriver, arrived in Beirut, checked into the Mediterranean Hotel, and rented a blue Volkswagen Golf at the Lena Car Agency. The same day he met with a Canadian tourist, Ronald Kohlberg, who stayed at the Royal Garden Hotel and rented a Simca Chrysler, also at Lena Car. Kohlberg was none other than David Mossad. The third client of the popular rental agency walked into its office the following day. That was Erica Chambers, who asked to rent a car for a trip in the mountains. She signed out a Datsun, which she parked close to her home. That night, 3 Israeli missile boats approached a deserted beach between Beirut and the port of Jouni, and left a large load of explosives on the wet sand. Kohlberg and Scriver were there. They loaded the explosives in the Volkswagen. On January 21, Peter Scriver checked out of his hotel, drove the blue Volkswagen to Rue Verdun, and parked it in full view of Erica Chambers's windows. He then took a cab to the airport and boarded a flight to Cyprus. Ronald Kohlberg checked out of his hotel, too, and moved to the Montmartre Hotel, in Jouni. At 3:45 p.m., as usual, Ali Hassan Salameh entered his Chevrolet. His bodyguards took the Land Rover, and the small motorcade headed for the Fatah headquarters. The cars moved down Rue Madame Curie and turned into Rue Verdun. From the 8th floor of the corner building, Erica Chambers watched them approach. Mossad stood beside her, holding a remote control device. The Chevrolet sailed smoothly past the blue Volkswagen. At that moment, Mossad pressed the switch on the remote control. The Volkswagen exploded, turning into a huge ball of fire. The Chevrolet, engulfed by the flames, blew up in turn. Chunks of metal and splinters of glass were projected violently upward. Windows in the neighboring houses were shattered and pieces of glass rained down on the sidewalk. Horrified passers-by stared at the bodies of the Chevrolet's passengers, strewn about the smoldering debris. Police cars and ambulances rushed toward the scene, and the medics pulled out of the Chevrolet's twisted chassis the bodies of the driver, the two bodyguards, and Ali Hassan Salameh. In Damascus, a harried messenger brought an urgent telegram to Yasser Arafat, who was presiding over a meeting at the Meridian Hotel. Stunned, Arafat perused the telegram and burst into tears. That same night, a rubber dinghy, launched from an Israeli missile boat, landed at Jowney Beach. Ronald Kohlberg and Erica Chambers jumped onto the dinghy that took them to its mothership. A few hours later, they were in Israel. The Lebanese police found their rented cars parked on the beach, keys in the ignition. Erica Mary Chambers was the real name of a Mossad agent, a British Jewess, who had lived in England and Australia before immigrating to Israel, and was recruited by the Mossad during her studies at Hebrew University. She returned to Israel and was never heard of again. That was the end of the quest and the end of Operation Wrath of God. Black September was eliminated. Many years later, some of the operation's details came to light. General Aaron Yariv admitted in a television interview that he had advised Prime Minister Golda Meir to kill as many of the Black September leaders as possible. He admitted that he was surprised by the fact that a military operation by our forces in Beirut and a few killings in Europe were enough to make the Fatah leaders stop the terrorism abroad. That proves that we were right by using this method for a certain time. But that dark affair had a surprising and promising epilogue. In 1996, the Israeli journalist Daniel Ben-Simon was invited by friends to a merry party in Jerusalem. He met a young, pleasant Palestinian there, impeccably dressed and speaking fluent English. He introduced himself as Ali Hassan Salameh. "That's the name of the man who masterminded the massacre of the Israeli athletes in Munich," Ben-Simon said. "He was my father," the young man said. "He was murdered by the Mossad." He told the amazed Ben-Simon that he had lived for years with his mother in Europe, and finally had come to Jerusalem as Yasser Arafat's guest. "I would never have believed," he added, "that the day would come when I'd be dancing together with young Israelis at a party in Jerusalem." He described his voyage throughout Israel, the warm hospitality of the Israelis he had met, and expressed his desire to help conciliate Israelis and Palestinians. "I am a man of peace, 100%, young Salameh said. My father lived in times of war and paid for that with his life. Now a new era has begun. I hope that peace between Israelis and Palestinians will be the most important event in the life of those two peoples." The part 4 is ending here. Did you enjoy learning something new today? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more fascinating knowledge. Your support helps us continue bringing you engaging content. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.